The story of HMAS Armidale is a relatively brief one, but nonetheless one that burns very brightly in the constellation of famous ships of the Royal Australian Navy, leading to the naming of two Royal Australian Navy warships in recognition of the accomplishments of both the ship and its crew, as well as the award of the first Victoria Cross ever awarded to a member of the Royal Australian Navy. But how did this all come about from a vessel that didn't even top out 1,000 tons? Well, Armadale was a Bathurst or Bathurst class corvette, as covered in the 5-minute guide that addresses their characteristics and overall service history. The ships were designed initially as local defence vessels for the Australian Navy, since there was no single British design which could fulfil that role at the time. British shipyards otherwise being the primary supplier of warships to the Royal Australian Navy during the interwar period. But while something like a County or Leander-class cruiser would work perfectly well for Australia's needs on the open ocean, when it came to operations such as minesweeping, anti-submarine warfare, local harbour defence, and the like, in the Royal Navy, which was of course considerably larger, these roles were filled by individual ships specialised in each of those individual tasks. The Royal Australian Navy had neither the crew nor the finances to be able to afford significant flotillas of all these different kinds of ships, and so the Bathurst class would come about through a somewhat convoluted design process that saw an initial prototype vessel, which would have given the name Kangaroo to the class, having these prototype plans cancelled and instead being completed as a much more mundane boom defence vessel, only to have the whole idea resurrected at the start of World War II for two primary reasons. Firstly, these ships could be built in Australia, and obviously Britain's shipyards were going to be somewhat occupied for the next few years, and secondly because, as mentioned before, they could do a lot on a single hull. Of the 60 ships that would eventually be built to this class specifications, Armadale was quite late in the game, the 40th vessel to be laid down. But thanks in large part to excellent work by Mort's Dock and Engineering Company, Australia's first dry dock including shipyard, she skipped up 12 places in the list, being the 28th vessel to commission. The hull being laid down on the 1st of September 1941, launched very shortly thereafter on the 24th of January 1942, and then commissioned into Australian naval service on the 11th of June 1942. When she'd been laid down, the war, as far as Australia was concerned, was on the other side of the planet. By the time she'd entered service, the war was pretty much on Australia's doorstep, with a seemingly unstoppable series of Japanese advances getting closer and closer to the North Australian coast. Although the Battle of Coral Sea had occurred while she was under construction, which had checked the Japanese advance towards Australia somewhat, and the Battle of Midway had been fought days before Armadale was commissioned, these checks to the Japanese carrier fleet didn't have any immediate effect on the ground warfare that was going on in what at the time was mostly the Dutch East Indies. With Japanese submarines operating relatively close and in some cases directly on the Australian coast, Armadale's role upon commissioning was largely convoy escort, working up and down the Australian coast, as well as escorting convoys from Australia to parts of the Dutch East Indies and the Australian-administered areas of New Guinea that were still unoccupied. But as the year progressed, the fighting got more and more intense, and eventually, in November 1942, Armadale, along with her sister ship Castlemaine and a smaller patrol boat, Kuru, were assigned a relatively complex operation that involved evacuating some troops that were on the ground, as well as a number of civilians, and then replacing/reinforcing them with a mixed contingent of troops that they had on board as well. Due to Japanese air attacks, this operation was somewhat delayed, as the ships understandably had to weave, dodge, and avoid incoming Japanese bombs. But whilst the civilians had been successfully evacuated, the soldiers still needed to be delivered, and the exhausted soldiers on land also relieved. And so Armadale and Kuru were ordered to try again the following day, as Castlemaine, with civilians aboard, was heading back for Darwin. Unfortunately, the next day, a contingent of Japanese torpedo bombers and fighters found the Armadale and commenced another attack. During this time, a number of torpedoes were released far too late, with one sailing over the ship, giving the impression to some on board that the Japanese were trying to use their torpedoes as bombs. But soon enough, Armadale was hit by a couple of torpedoes, and, well, at 650 tons, the corvette was unlikely to have survived one, let alone two. She began to sink relatively rapidly. This was, however, complicated by the fact that the Japanese fighters decided that strafing the survivors in their life rafts and boats with cannon and machine gun fire was apparently a good idea. One of these bullets struck an ordinary seaman, Edward Sheean, in the back. Whether he concluded that with a machine gun wound to the back and about to be in a life raft for potentially several days he had little chance of survival anyway, or because he was finally fed up with the Japanese strafing helpless sailors, Teddy Sheean climbed back aboard the sinking ship, strapped himself to the 20mm Oerlikon mount just after the mainmast, and started pouring fire into the surprised Japanese aircraft, shooting down at least one, damaging several others, and keeping the rest occupied dodging his fire. Having strapped himself to the Oerlikon mount, Sheean was dragged down with the ship, but, taking one final breath before he went under the surface, he kept up the fire for as long as he could, with several crew members witnessing tracer fire rising from beneath the waves as Armadale began its final plunge. This action no doubt saved many lives, dissuading the Japanese from their strafing runs and causing most of their aircraft to give the whole thing up as a bad idea and head home. For this action, Sheean received a mention in dispatches at the time. However, many amongst the crew that had witnessed it and those who heard their accounts felt that he deserved something of a higher reward than a simple mention in dispatches. Over time, this feeling would grow. One of the Australian Navy's Collins-class submarines carries the name HMAS Sheean as an example of this. And elsewhere in the same Navy, there is the Armadale class of patrol boat, led, of course, by HMAS Armidale. As the 20th century turned into the 21st century, there was significantly more support for revisiting this particular award. But whilst there was considerable resistance amongst the upper echelons of the political establishment and, surprisingly enough, the military, after a number of panel reviews, a recommendation was made to posthumously award Sheean the Victoria Cross. This recommendation was accepted on the 10th of August 2020, and 2 days later Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who is of course also Queen of Australia, approved the award of the Victoria Cross for Australia posthumously to Edward Sheean. The medal was subsequently awarded at the end of last year to Sheean's nephew. However, whilst Sheean's outstanding bravery definitely does deserve to be recognised, and indeed now has been, we also have to remember that there were 49 survivors from Armadale, as well as the 100 who perished in her sinking and the subsequent aftermath. And if it wasn't for their testimony, we wouldn't know the details that led to the aforementioned award. And of course, remembering that while Sheean's part in the story ended with the sinking of the ship itself, those other survivors still had to make it to safety, which was not going to be easy given the circumstances of the sinking and where they were in the ocean. So what was their story in this operation? Well, bear in mind that to be serving aboard Armadale in 1942, the vast majority of the crew would have been born in the late 1910s or early 1920s. Given that this video is going out in 2021, that's pretty much around about 100 years ago, give or take a few years. So you might think that, as has happened within living memory for World War I survivors, perhaps the story of HMAS Armidale and her surviving crew is something that we will only ever be able to read about. But, luckily and incredibly fortunately, one of the viewers of this channel just so happened to be related to the last survivor of HMAS Armidale. At the time, an ordinary seaman just like Teddy Sheean, Ray Leonard managed to survive the sinking, and in the 21st century was a key part of the campaign to get Sheean's achievements recognised. Despite the travel restrictions imposed by the pandemic, as obviously I would have vastly preferred to have been able to go and meet and interview him in person, he was kind enough to grant permission for the use of the following interview which he gave shortly before Anzac Day last year. Sadly, during the preparation time for this video and a week before he would have turned 98, Ray Leonard passed away in June 2021. Thus, in honour of the entire crew of HMAS Armidale, but most especially with thanks to the kindness and generosity of Ray Leonard, let's hear firsthand what that final voyage was like.
Hello, good friends in Dili, Timor. My name is Ray Leonard and I served in the Navy in the Second World War. But before I comment any further on that, let me say that Anzac Day is almost upon us, and I'm delighted to learn that you're going to do your best despite these terrible COVID-19 days of nervousness, to put on some sort of a function in Dili to celebrate Anzac Day. Anzac Day has always been so important to me, and over 40 or 50 years I've attempted to march in so many Melbourne marches. This year, unfortunately, I will not be there, but I'm so pleased that you are. I was just 19 years of age, just turned 90, when on the 1st of June 1942, I joined the brand new HMAS Armidale in Sydney, ready to sail, and not for a moment imagining that in exactly 6 months' time that beautiful ship would be lying at the bottom of the Timor Sea. But that comes later in the story. Armadale served in the Pacific Islands around New Guinea for a couple of months before we were sent to Darwin to carry out a 3-ship operation to land a number of troops, Dutch, Javanese troops, about 66 in number, onto Bathurst beach, where they were so badly needed by those hard-pressed and valiant Australian soldiers, up against a force of some thousands of Japanese. We went off from Darwin as a covert operation to carry out this fatal and final mission, which was not covert for long because we were spotted by a Jap reconnaissance plane and our cover was lost, and we knew in no time we'd be under attack. And then we were, at first by a few planes which dropped their bombs and didn't hit us, made another raid a little bit later, and again the same procedure, dropping bombs, once more missing us. I wondered at the time why. I thought maybe because of the skill of our captain in moving his ship to avoid them, or our gunners firing briskly to keep the attacking planes high. Or there was a third factor, just good old-fashioned luck. I experienced a lot of luck, mostly good, during the Second World War. We pushed on our mission to Bathurst, and we arrived in Armadale late because we lost so much time avoiding attacking planes. We didn't get a signal to land our troops, so we had to get out of the area quickly before being spotted by a reconnaissance plane the next morning. We observed Castlemaine and Carew, which was the third tiny ship involved, transfer some women and children from Carew to Castlemaine. They were taken back to the safety of Darwin, which left Armadale and Carew together, wondering what we were to do now that our mission had failed. The answer came in a message from Darwin: go back and complete the job that you didn't do last night. This we proceeded to do, knowing too well we would really be involved in a more vicious attack than the last one or two. That's the way it turned out. Indeed, we were attacked by a number of planes. We again avoided them. Lucky we were, but not the final group that attacked. 13 in number, 9 bombers, 3 Zero fighters and a float plane. They worked out their method of attack. They were on the distant horizon in a semicircle. They gradually came in closer and closer to us, and it was obvious there's no way we were able to avoid them. So we fired our guns as the Zero fired theirs. They raked our ship only seconds before the bombers arrived, dropping a bomb and then 2 torpedoes, which blew up Armadale in one great explosion. Almost immediately, the ship was sinking and the captain was giving the order, abandon ship. Well, that is what we did. We abandoned ship. Those which were capable of doing so. Already we had a number of badly wounded and dead sailors who couldn't leave the ship. But those who did were strafed by the Japanese fighters until it seemed their ammunition was depleted, and they and the bombers left us alone in the sea, surprisingly surrounded and frightened by some sharks and deadly sea snakes. Notwithstand what seemed to be a desperate situation, I don't believe any of these sharks or sea snakes attacked us or did any harm. we got together, the survivors, eventually as a group around the single craft we had floating, the ship's motorboat, with the captain now aboard and taking with him the badly wounded and dying. We got ready for a very stressful night. It was stressful, with dying men calling out for help when there was no help we could give them. By morning, some had passed away. We were able to take stock of affairs. Before long, as the hours slipped by, the captain realised we were not going to get any sudden friendly plane fly over to rescue us. Nothing like that. The day was spent with ourselves clinging to flotsam and jetsam and already beginning to build something that eventually would constitute a raft, when by the next day there was no help. The captain left with the badly wounded, and with his knowledge of navigation and a compass, we hoped, and he hoped, to get back to Darwin. Back at the scene of the sinking, our raft building was progressing. We were able to cling to it, and finally a number of us get on the raft. And then a strange thing happened. We suddenly became aware of our whaler, which we were unable to launch at the sinking of the ship. But there she was, beside us, in a desperate situation herself. She was just below the surface of the water, and obviously in a badly damaged condition. Nonetheless, one of the men on the raft said, "I think we could raise her up." It seemed an impossibility to this, but our senior officer with us now, the gunner of the ship, the gunner's officer, said, "Go ahead, have a go." So with half of the men on the raft and the other half on the water each side of the sunken whaler, we gradually did manage to get it bit by bit up on to the raft, with the men on the raft changing position from one end to another just to lift the whaler. Eventually we plugged the bullet holes, and with continuous bailing made her, in a way, seaworthy. With still no help coming, the gunnery officer made a decision. He was going to take with him in the whaler 29 men, including himself, and row it to Darwin. This seemed fanciful, but it seemed to be our only hope. And I was one of the men chosen with him to go in the whaler. It was a very sad moment as those of us in the whaler said goodbye to our mates on the raft. It was a moment of silence. Not a word was spoken. I felt very, very sad. I suppose every man wondered who was better off, he in the raft or he in the whaler. On the whaler, things were pretty tough anyhow. We had almost nothing to eat or drink. The rations that we did have, we left with the men on the raft. And we attempted to row, which became an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. 29 men on an overcrowded whaler, taking it in turns to row, which exhausted us no end. We desperately wanted to get off the bottom of the whaler where we were crouched to take our turn behind the oars. But by the time we got to the oars and had rowed for 2 minutes, we were exhausted and wanted to get back to the bottom of the boat. Our food had all gone within a couple of days, and our physical and mental condition began to deteriorate. We had perceptual disturbances in which some of those with us were seeing the Sydney Harbour shoreline, one man in particular wanting to dive in and swim there until we had to prevent him from doing so. We rowed in this fashion during the day. We rested at night, day by day, and getting very, very low in spirit and in health. I must say, at one point, it looked quite hopeless, but somehow or other, we urged each other to keep it up. And then, suddenly, there it was. A rescue craft, a beautiful Catalina, arrived, dropped a note to us, encouraging us, telling us it had no provisions for us because they had dropped them to men on the raft. To hear that news was wonderful indeed, and it kept us going, not rowing any longer. We'd stopped rowing, and we were beginning to plan our future, and overcame some more planes, this time Hudson bombers, which dropped a note to us. Well done, lads, we take our hats off to you. Help will be on the way within a day. And by the next day, help did arrive in the form of HMAS Armidale, which took us on board up the Jacob's ladder, pulling us and dragging us up and holding us up because we couldn't stand once on board, but looking after us very well. And by the next day, resting under the care of Kalgoorlie crew, we did arrive in Darwin. And we were very soon put into a hospital, and we were going to recover, but we had bad news. The very bad news was the men on the raft, although seen the second time to be fewer in number, some were still alive, but the third attempt to find them failed. They were never seen again, and to this day we don't know anything about what must have been a most pathetic end for them. Well, we recovered sufficiently in a hospital to make our way south and to get to Sydney and meet loved ones. And some of us would move on to Melbourne and go into hospital again before taking survivor's leave for a little bit longer. And that's about all I've got to say at this stage. Thank you.